The dinner was held on the top floor of a glass building that overlooked the city like it belonged to it. My sister's company was celebrating a record quarter, and the event had all the quiet arrogance of success: tailored suits, low lighting, and polished laughter. My mother insisted I attend. "Show support," she said. "It's important." When we reached the table, my sister stood proudly beside her CEO, introducing everyone with practiced ease. When it was my turn, my mother rested a hand on my shoulder and smiled. "And this," she said in a voice light, "is our failed child." The word dropped into the room with deceptive softness. A few guests laughed politely. Someone murmured, "Every family has one." My sister didn't correct it. She gave a small apologetic smile that felt rehearsed. I kept my posture steady. The CEO looked at me a second longer than necessary. "Failed?" he asked casually. "Oh, she's still figuring things out," my mother added quickly. "Different path." Different. The conversation moved on. Wine was poured. Deals were discussed. The hierarchy had been established. I felt the familiar tightening in my chest, but I didn't defend myself. What they didn't know was that I had signed the contract 3 days earlier. My sister has always been introduced with an achievement attached to her name. From the time we were children, her report cards were framed. Her debate trophies were displayed on shelves that caught the sunlight. Teachers called her exceptional. Relatives called her brilliant. My parents called her the one who's going somewhere. I was described differently. She's creative. She's thoughtful. She's still figuring things out. That last phrase followed me into adulthood like a soft verdict. Still figuring things out. When my sister graduated from an Ivy League university, my parents hosted a party. When she landed her first corporate role, my father updated his email signature to include her title. At holiday dinners, conversations cantered on her quarterly bonuses, her executive retreats, her networking trips to cities with glass towers and polished floors. I never resented her success. What stung was the contrast. When relatives asked about me, my mother's tone shifted into something apologetic. "She's exploring," she would say. Different path. Different meant unstable. Unstable meant unfinished. The irony is that my work required more precision than applause. I built strategies for companies in transition. I worked in confidential acquisitions in rooms where outcomes were measured quietly and decisively. But because I couldn't post about it or attach a flashy title to my name, my silence was interpreted as absence. My sister's progress was visible. Mine was structural. My parents equated visibility with value, titles with trajectory, promotion with permanence. So by the time my mother called me the failed child, she wasn't inventing a story. She was repeating the one they'd told themselves for years. And repetition has a way of sounding like truth until context shifts. I never corrected them because correction would have required disclosure. My work isn't designed for public explanation. I specialize in corporate restructuring and confidential acquisitions, the kind of assignments that begin quietly and end with entire divisions reorganized without fanfare. 3 months before that dinner, I stepped away from my last visible consulting contract. To my parents, it looked like another pivot. Another uncertain move. "What now?" my father had asked cautiously. "A transition," I answered. But transition doesn't translate well to people who measure stability through routine. The truth was more precise. A regional firm had retained me to oversee integration planning for a merger involving multiple mid-sized companies. The contract required a non-disclosure agreement before my involvement could even be acknowledged. I signed it without hesitation. Silence wasn't optional. It was contractual. While my sister posted updates about leadership summits and expansion forecasts, I attended closed-door strategy sessions. While my parents repeated that I was still figuring things out, I reviewed compliance frameworks and operational redundancies that would determine which executives remained and which departments were absorbed. None of that could be shared at dinner tables. Confidentiality can look like unemployment from a distance. And because I didn't defend myself publicly, they assumed I had nothing to defend. It never occurred to them to ask what I was building. They preferred the narrative they understood. The golden child rising. The other one was drifting. What they didn't know was that my so-called drift had been deliberate. And sometimes the most powerful position in a room is the one no one bothers to investigate. It might have passed as a careless joke if it had only happened once. But halfway through dessert, as conversation turned toward expansion forecasts, my mother repeated it. "You know," she said to my sister's CEO with a soft laugh, "she's our failed child." The word landed more sharply the second time. Failed. Not exploring. Not transitioning. Failed. A few executives smiled politely, unsure whether to join the humor. One of them did. My sister's lips curved slightly, just enough to signal comfort with the narrative. "She takes the scenic route," my sister added lightly. Scenic. The CEO's fork paused midair. "Failed?" he asked, not laughing. My mother waved her hand dismissively. "Oh, she's just different." Different. The room waited. I could feel the heat in my face, but I kept my expression level. I folded my napkin slowly and placed it beside my plate. No sudden movements. No correction. Humiliation only gains momentum when it's fed. The CEO's gaze lingered on me a fraction longer than before. Not with pity. With curiosity. "Different how?" he asked. My mother hesitated. I met his eyes calmly. "I work in corporate restructuring," I said evenly. Silence followed, not explosive but suspended. My sister shifted in her seat. The laughter had stopped. The comment that once sounded harmless now hovered awkwardly between titles and reality. I didn't defend myself. I didn't explain. Because the line had already been crossed. And what came next wouldn't require volume. Only timing. The folder had been beside me all evening. Slim. Black. Unremarkable. It rested against the leg of my chair, almost invisible beneath the tablecloth. I had brought it because I came straight from the office, not because I anticipated needing it. Inside were draft integration notes for a merger my firm was overseeing. The acquiring company had been expanding quietly for years, consolidating smaller operations and restructuring mid-sized ones under a unified infrastructure. One of the mid-sized companies under review was my sister's. Her division specifically. I had known about the overlap for weeks. I had read the financial disclosures, the projected redundancies, the leadership restructuring proposals that would follow once the merger was finalized. Nothing personal, just structural assessment. The irony was architectural. Across the table, my sister spoke confidently about her department's performance metrics. "We've exceeded projections," she said, glancing toward her CEO. "The growth trajectory is stable." Stable. I kept my hands folded loosely on my lap. The folder pressed lightly against my knee. I wasn't there to confront anyone. The contract was under review. Nothing had been publicly announced. Confidentiality was part of the work. But as the word failed echoed in my mind, the presence of that folder took on weight. It contained leverage. Not emotional leverage. Operational leverage. If the merger proceeded as projected, leadership roles would be recalibrated. Departments would merge. Certain executive positions would be reassessed based on redundancy and efficiency, including hers. The CEO hadn't commented on my earlier answer. He simply watched. The folder remained closed. But sometimes the most powerful object in a room is the one no one thinks to open. And no one at that table had the faintest idea what rested beside my chair. The conversation shifted toward what my sister called the biggest move of the year. "We're in advanced talks," she said, her tone confident and almost triumphant. "This merger could double our operational reach." My father nodded approvingly, as if he personally negotiated the terms. "It's about time," he added. "You've earned it." My mother leaned in, lowering her voice as though discussing something delicate. "The integration team has already been selected," she said proudly. "Top-tier oversight." Top-tier. I glanced at the folder beside my chair. My sister continued, unaware of the layers beneath her words. "Once the regulatory review clears, we'll be positioned nationally." Regulatory review. I let the phrase settle. "What's the timeline?" one executive asked. "Soon," she replied. "Very soon." Her CEO smiled slightly but didn't correct her. He knew. At least partially. The merger they were celebrating wasn't speculative anymore. The integration framework had already been drafted. The review committee had finalized its internal recommendations. And the leadership oversight structure was set. The irony wasn't dramatic. It was procedural. My sister spoke as if the expansion were inevitable. As if approval were a formality. But integration is never ceremonial. It's evaluative. An evaluation requires authority. Authority she hadn't connected to the woman sitting quietly across from her. My mother lifted her glass again. To success, she said. The word success lingered in the air. No one at the table understood how fragile it could become when structure shifts. They were celebrating a contract. I was overseeing it. And the collision between perception and reality was closing in quietly. The moment arrived without announcement. My sister had just finished outlining her division's projected expansion when her CEO leaned slightly toward her. It was a subtle shift, close enough for privacy, distant enough not to alarm the table. He spoke softly. I couldn't hear the first few words, but I saw my sister's expression change. "What?" she whispered back. He glanced briefly in my direction before returning his attention to her. "That's the integration lead," he murmured. The fork in her hand paused midair. She looked at me differently now, not with superiority, not with dismissal. With calculation. "You're serious?" she asked under her breath. He nodded once. The atmosphere around the table tightened. My mother noticed the shift immediately. "Is everything all right?" she asked, trying to keep the tone light. My sister didn't answer her. She kept her eyes on me. "You're overseeing the review?" she asked louder this time. The room quieted. The executives who had been half listening straightened in their chairs. My father stopped mid-sentence. I held her gaze calmly. "Yes," I said. No elaboration. No performance. The laughter from earlier felt distant now, almost misplaced. The CEO leaned back in his seat, expression neutral but unmistakably aware. Energy changes quickly when authority is recognized. And recognition had just entered the room. No one reached for their glass. No one smiled. Because the hierarchy they had assumed was suddenly unstable. And everyone could feel it. The CEO set his glass down deliberately and turned toward the table. "For clarity," he said evenly, "I should formally introduce someone." The room stilled. He looked at me with professional recognition rather than social courtesy. "She is the senior director overseeing our integration review." The title landed without theatrics. My mother blinked. My father's posture shifted subtly, his shoulders tightening as though recalibrating years of assumption in real time. My sister's expression didn't crumble. It recalculated. "You're leading the integration?" she asked, her voice carefully controlled. "My team is," I replied. "I'm responsible for structural evaluation." There was no pride in my tone. No sharpness. Just a fact. The CEO continued. "Her firm has been conducting the operational assessment for this merger." Operational assessment. The phrase carried weight the table had not prepared for. My sister glanced at her father, then back at me. "You didn't mention this," she said. "I wasn't asked," I answered calmly. A flicker of discomfort crossed my mother's face. "I had no idea," she murmured. "That's understandable," I replied. The executives at the table had stopped pretending this was social conversation. They were listening now. Measuring words. Reassessing context. My sister attempted to steady the moment. "And what does that mean for our division?" "It means we're evaluating alignment," I said. "Redundancies. Governance. Sustainability." The language was neutral, but the implication was clear. The division she had celebrated moments ago was under review. Not by a faceless committee. By me. I didn't open the folder beside my chair. I didn't need to. Authority doesn't require display. The CEO nodded. "The review has been thorough," he added. My father cleared his throat. "This is impressive," he said, choosing the word carefully. I held his gaze. "It's structural," I replied. No one laughed this time. Because the room had inverted. Not violently. Not dramatically. Precisely. They had introduced me as the failed child. The CEO had introduced me differently. And titles, when spoken in the right context, rewrite narratives instantly. I didn't defend myself. I didn't remind them of the earlier remark. I simply existed in the role they had never imagined I occupied. Power doesn't need volume. It needs a position. And mine had just been clarified. The laughter didn't return. The room, once comfortably arranged around assumptions, tightened into something more careful. My sister's hands remained still on the table. She wasn't angry. She was calculating. Years of confidence built on visible hierarchy had shifted under her feet in a matter of seconds. "You're reviewing our division?" she asked again as if repetition might soften the reality. Yes, I replied. Not defensively. Not triumphantly. Just yes. My mother looked at me as though seeing me for the first time not as the daughter who drifted but as someone she had miscategorized. We didn't know, she said quietly. I know, I answered. My father stared at the cap on the table as if it had become something unfamiliar. His certainty had dissolved into evaluation. Across the table, the executives who had laughed earlier avoided eye contact entirely. One of them adjusted his tie. Another reached for his water without drinking. The hierarchy had collapsed without confrontation. Not because I demanded it. Because context replaced assumption. My sister straightened slowly. Well, she said, her voice measured now. I suppose we'll be working closely. The tone was no longer superior. I was careful. The room had recalibrated. And in that recalibration something subtle but permanent had shifted. Not through noise. Through clarity. She caught up with me near the balcony doors once the table began dispersing. Can we talk? She asked. Her tone had lost its edge. It was measured and now controlled. Of course, I said. We stepped away from the others into the quieter space where city lights filtered through the glass. You could have told me, she began. I couldn't, I replied. Because of the NDA? Yes. She folded her arms not defensively but to steady herself. Does this mean my position is at risk? It means your division is being evaluated, I said calmly. The same way every division is. She searched my face for something personal. This isn't about dinner, is it? No, I answered. Dinner was social. This is structural. The distinction mattered. I didn't mean to, she started. I know, I interrupted gently. But impact doesn't disappear because intent was casual. Silence settled between us, not hostile, just recalibrated. I need to understand where we stand, she said finally. You stand where performance and structure align, I replied. That's the only metric. She nodded slowly. No apology was exchanged. No accusation made. Just clarity. When we returned to the table, the dynamic had shifted from assumption to awareness. Not because I corrected her emotionally. Because I established the boundary professionally. And boundaries once defined don't require repetition. The merger moved forward exactly as scheduled. There were no sudden announcements, no dramatic removals. The process unfolded the way all integration reviews do, through metrics, documentation, and comparative analysis. Departments were assessed against efficiency benchmarks. Redundant roles were identified. Leadership layers were streamlined. The language in the internal memos was clinical and precise. Operational alignment. Cost optimization. Strategic consolidation. My sister's division wasn't eliminated, but it was restructured. Certain managerial responsibilities were redistributed. Reporting lines were adjusted. Budget approvals required additional oversight. Nothing personal. Nothing punitive. The review didn't reference family dinners or careless introductions. It referenced performance data, scalability forecasts, and integration efficiency. My sister adapted. She attended the restructuring meetings with professional composure. Her tone shifted, slightly less declarative and more analytical. She didn't accuse me. She couldn't. Because the process wasn't emotional. It was structural. My parents didn't mention the dinner again. They spoke about the merger cautiously now, as if aware that celebration requires understanding. The hierarchy that once existed in our family had not reversed loudly. It was corrected quietly. And correction, when rooted in process rather than pride, leaves no room for argument. There was no revenge. Only reality. And reality doesn't raise its voice. That dinner didn't redefine my career. It redefined their perception. For years I had allowed the narrative to exist unchecked. The failed daughter. The one still searching. The one without visible traction. It was easier to let them believe it than to argue. Arguing would have required explanation. Explanation would have required permission. And I had already learned that people who are committed to misunderstanding you rarely accept clarification. What changed that night wasn't their laughter. It was the context that followed it. Failure is a label used by people who don't understand strategy. Strategy doesn't always look impressive at dinner tables. It looks quiet, deliberate, invisible until it becomes unavoidable. My sister's success was never my enemy. The hierarchy built around it was. They equated visibility with value. I built leverage instead. When the room recalibrated, I didn't rise above anyone. I stood exactly where I had been building all along. I don't need them to narrate my success differently now. I don't need apologies to validate what I already know. Respect doesn't require applause. It requires recognition. And recognition, when it arrives without argument, lasts longer. You don't correct people by shouting over them. You correct them by building something so structured, so undeniable that silence replaces laughter. And once silence settles, labels lose their power. Failure was never my reality. It was their misunderstanding. And misunderstanding eventually corrects itself.